Arts Center YouTube or the Story Arts Center Facebook. The live stream will come up and there'll be a chat. Yeah. Am I getting a countdown or anything, or do I just start talking?
I love that you made notes. You made notes.
Yeah.
Did all the research for my stats, but it's all on my. It's like, okay, I'm going to remember that. I only have. Yeah, especially when you're nervous. I should have done that. Do you remember what they said about how many minutes per question for? Do you remember how many minutes per question? Yeah, there's a bell that they're going to ring.
Good afternoon and evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at the brand new library at Centennial College's Story Arts Center. I'm Mary Vallis, a professor of journalism here at Centennial College. We are proud to host this pre-election panel as a way of providing our broadcasting and journalism students with a real-life opportunity to cover politics, and also for Centennial to play a role in engaging young people in the electoral process. We're all here because we care about our city and our community. We're also here because we're concerned about the lack of public engagement in the democratic process, particularly among young people like you. We want to understand why it's happening and how we can strengthen the bridge between youth and the ballot box. Our first order of business tonight is to acknowledge the traditional land we are on, which is always important, but tonight even more so because our country just marked the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Our commitment to reconciliation goes past official proclamations and is something we consider in many, many ways on our campus. Centennial College is proud to be part of a rich history of education in this province and in this city. We acknowledge that we are on treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of all First Peoples of Canada as we strengthen ties with the communities we serve and build the future through learning and through our graduates. Today, the traditional meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in the communities that have grown in the treaty lands of the Mississaugas. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people and accept our responsibility to honor all our relations. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I'd like to acknowledge everyone watching online. Welcome. We hope you enjoy the live stream. Please feel free to participate by leaving your questions for the panelists in the comments on Facebook and YouTube. We're watching for them. Students from our broadcasting and journalism programs are participating in this event tonight. I hope that if they stop you in the halls for a question or a photo, that you will give them a few minutes of your time. Now, before we begin, here's a brief pre-recorded message from Dean Nate Horowitz, who is the dean here of our campus in the School of Communications, Media, Art, and Design.
Welcome to the discussion about democracy. Hi, I'm Nate Horowitz, Dean of the School of Communications, Media Arts and Design. Democracy means that people decide who to vote for and when to vote. People should not be told that they must vote. This is not going to get the vote out, and it's not going to engage people, and democracy ultimately will be stifled. It's important that for democracy to be preserved, that there be a great deal of voter engagement, particularly among young voters. In the US, there's an organization called Rock the Vote. It works to engage young people in voting. That's what the panel will focus on this evening. Thank you to our students, Mary, and the faculty for making this evening event happen for the sake of democracy. Thank you.
Who is a Toronto Star journalist and graduate of Centennial's Contemporary Journalism program. We're pleased to welcome him back to campus tonight.
Thanks very much, Mary, and hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be back at the Story Arts Center, especially in this shiny new library. Back in 2019, when I was studying here, this new build was still under construction, so I'm not bitter, just happy to be able to come back and see how it turned out. We have 4 panelists with us for the discussion tonight, and I'll introduce them shortly. But first, let's go over the format of tonight's event. Initially, I'll ask each panelist for an introductory statement. Then, I'll ask some general questions about the role of youth in the democratic process. Then we'll turn to the social media moderator to take questions from those watching online. And finally, we'll open up the event for questions from the journalists in the room. Our event will formally conclude at 8:30 p.m., and we ask that you leave the library by 9 at the latest. Without much ado, here are our panelists for tonight. We have Tima Shah, who is president of the CCSAI, Centennial Student Association. She is currently studying human resources and was previously an Ontario high school teacher. Welcome, Tima.
Hello, thank you for having me.
David Ryder has been the City Hall bureau chief for the Toronto Star since 2010. He oversaw coverage of Rob Ford's chaotic mayoralty, John Tory's 2 terms in office, and the city's pandemic response. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Mary-Margaret McMahon is a former Toronto City Councillor and now MPP for Beaches, East York. She knows this area and the municipal election process well. She is also well known for her unfailingly positive attitude and approach to politics. Welcome, Mary-Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Jad El Ghali of Future Majority, an organization that recruits, trains, and empowers young Canadians to participate in the democratic process. Jad is a U of T student who has presented a youth TEDx talk about multiculturalism and academic research papers on partisanship, youth electoral participation, and Canada's electoral system. He's also worked with Elections Canada and Elections Ontario in the past. Welcome, Jad.
Thank you.
You might be wondering why there are no council candidates on the panel today. That's no coincidence, and it's actually by design. We're mindful that inviting one candidate could provide a platform for one, but not others, which wouldn't be fair. And unfortunately, we just don't have the room to invite them all. More than 30 people are running for mayor alone. I also want to take a moment to introduce Marva Trim, a journalism student, who will be watching for your comments and questions on our live stream and social media. So folks watching online, please send us your questions and comments at any time during today's program. And lastly, Maddie Cowan, a Leaside High School student, is playing the role of timekeeper tonight. She'll keep us all in check and ring a bell if any of the panelists go over the allotted 1-minute time limit on their responses. Just for a demonstration, give it a ring, Maddie. Thank you. And now on to the main event. I'm going to start by asking each of you for a 1-minute opening statement on why you agreed to participate. What is it about the connection between youth and democracy, or lack thereof, that makes you feel this discussion is necessary? And we'll start with Tima, please.
Hello. Democracy is a big part of CCSAI. It's a nonprofit organization that represents students, but students ultimately elect who is going to be representing them. And we have a lot of experience in having students run for candidates, having students run for elections, vote for elections, and also times when we don't have students and we don't have representatives for students in our democracy. So I hope that with the insights that I have at Democracy with CCSAI, we're able to make those connections to democracy in our bigger populations and in having youth being engaged in that process.
Thanks, Tima. Jad, you're up next.
Thank you. So of course, living in Canada, democracy is the basic fabric that we rely on as a society. And it's unfortunate that we see that a lot of older people are holding the baton, but none of the younger people want to take it. When I was working in Elections Ontario or Elections Canada, in both provincial and federal elections, you would see old people, even ones that can't really walk well, would come and do everything they can to cast their ballot, even if I have to take the box out to them to their car or to the bus that brought them. But yet young people were scarce. You would barely see them coming. And so the whole idea is Canada is an aging population, we know that. But at the end of the day, we still need people to vote in leaders who are going to run our country. And when young people are facing critical issues like the environment, housing crisis, affordability, can't buy a house, well, then we need to make our voices heard so that politicians actually listen to our problems and actually cater to us and start making policies to gain our vote. Because politicians care about Canadians who vote, not just all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, and David, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. I think democracy is in a fragile, kind of endangered place right now, and this discussion is more urgently needed than ever. As City Hall Bureau Chief, I cover elections, I cover politicians, and I cover civic engagement. We saw in the provincial election an extremely low rate of voter participation. There's a lot of fears that in the civic election right now, it's going to be even lower. I think we can get into it. There's lots of reasons why primarily older people still vote more than younger people. I think you could argue that young people in this city in some ways are being forced out by housing prices and other things that make them feel like they don't belong or they can't fully participate in our society. I think it's really important to bridge that. At the same time, there's structural impediments. I spent the day with a city councillor who is running for re-election, and her primary challenger, who was born the year that the city councillor was first elected. It's really, really hard for young people, a lot of whom are trying to break through and become city councillors. It's really, really hard for them to beat incumbents, many of whom have been in power for decades. So I welcome this discussion, and I'll be interested to hear your questions and what other people say.
Thank you. And Mary-Margaret, you're last.
Thank you very much. And I just am here to empower you to use your voices, and your voices matter. They actually do. And it's your future, and it's a bit of a mess right now, and you actually hold the balance of power. If you all rise up and you actually vote and get your friends, neighbors, enemies, anyone you know to vote your age, that will make a difference. And it will be a different world, because what you're facing is different than what I faced and what older people than me who are in power still have faced. And I want to tell you that there's a story about someone who, I won't go into all the deals, but they won by 9 votes. So how many of you are in the room right now? It can be as few as 9 votes that make a difference between who is elected and who is not. And that, just look in the mirror, you actually have that power, and I want you to use it.
Thank you so much. Let's continue this discussion by asking some more questions about young people and democracy. And again, each of these questions is for all the panelists. Just for the sake of format, I'll ask one of you to start us off by answering the question first. Once that panelist's 1 minute is up, the rest of you will have a chance to share your thoughts and comments. A reminder to those watching online to participate in this forum by posting your questions in the comments. I'll start off by sharing a bit of a personal note. Growing up in New Delhi, I couldn't wait for the day I got to vote in my first election. The sheer novelty of getting to take part in the largest democratic exercise in the world and wearing that stripe of indelible ink that you get on your index finger when you vote in India, it had me super hyped up. According to the Future Majority website, young Canadians make up 40% of eligible voters today, but less than half of them vote. Jad, what do you think is holding young people back from voting and otherwise participating in politics?
Thank you. So I see it as really 2 streams that would kind of stop them from voting. One would be lack of political knowledge. We have a severe civic literacy problem in Canada today. The Samara Institute for Democracy issued a study where in 1985, 90% of Canadians could identify their premier. Compared to 2015, only 60% could. The Forum poll also released data showing that 9 out of 10 Canadians today would fail the Canadian citizenship test. So when we're looking at engaging in democracy, well, then we need our youth to know how our democracy works. We need them to know if they have a certain problem, which level of government is going to solve that problem. And by doing so, you motivate them to go out and vote and to make sure that they're trying to get their concerns heard, because you have people that are going to vote in provincial elections trying to solve a federal jurisdiction problem. And so that's the issue. The other one is lack of ambition, and that's on no fault of youth. It's about institutions not kind of hyping them up.
Thank you, Jad. Would any of the panelists like to chip in? Tima.
I want to say that a lot of youth are students, and students are already doing a lot of homework. When election season comes around, it feels like it's more homework to do. Students are thinking, okay, I already have to research for this assignment, and now I have to research 30 candidates to decide who I want my mayor to be. And I think that one of the things, one of the recommendations or something that would make it easier for youth to vote is if that research was easier to do. So, for example, in our student association, we have all of the candidates submit information that could be presented all at once to students while they're voting.
Yes, please, don't wait for me to acknowledge you. Go ahead.
So Future Majority has something called Vote Tube before every election, provincial and federal, where all the leaders of the major parties come out and make a video stating their aims for the election. So that's like one aspect where kids can do it. Another thing is, when I talk about civic literacy, I'm talking about in the actual classroom. For example, in Ontario, we're only taught in grade 5 and grade 10. And grade 5 is way early before you can vote, and grade 10 is still a couple years before you turn 18. So the whole education system has to take into consideration democratic knowledge.
I'm going to jump in and just reaffirm and echo the need for civics classes in school, and I think at all levels. I think if anything, the whole convoy movement, the occupation of Ottawa, where people were kind of making up sort of bills that they said would cause the government to fall, or citing US Miranda laws and things, really laid bare that a lot of Canadians don't understand how the government works. And if I'm honest, I'll say I was probably took me a month of being City Hall Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star before I could sit in a council meeting and totally understand what was going on. And even then, 12 years later, there's still some times where I'm like, did they just vote on something? What happened here? It's complicated, but you could smooth out, you could make people feel engaged, including young people, if in school you say, this is how it works, and bring, we get university students sometimes to City Hall, but I think there should be grade 5 students walking through, and just a basic primer. And I could design a lesson that would be fun on how does something come to as an idea to City Hall, and how does it eventually get passed.
Yes, I would agree. Civics in every grade, starting in kindergarten, and all the way up, and for seniors and whomever. So many people don't know what the politicals do at which level, and I was one of those people too, not too long ago. And we do tours at City Hall, we do tours at Queen's Park and House of Commons. In Calgary, their City Hall, they have a City Hall school where kids will go there, youth will go there for a week, and you will actually plan and design a city park, or some sort of, say, Vision Zero planning for a corner. There's also, I'll do a shout out to Maximum City, which is another great group that does that kind of stuff on their own in Toronto. So it helps educate people. But I would also say to get informed, all candidates debates are a great way to get informed, but if you can't go, I'm sure lots of them are online, and flyers that come in your mail. And if the person comes to your door, the candidate, challenge them with your questions.
Thank you very much. What a way to start off the discussion, and keeping with the theme of connection of literacy, civic literacy, of course, we sometimes hear of a disconnect when talking about youth participation in politics. So it can be a disconnection in terms of interests, or a disconnect in priorities. How can politicians meet young folks where they are? And Mary-Margaret, I'm going to throw this one to you to begin. How do you connect with young people in your riding and formerly your Toronto Council ward?
Well, much to my kids' chagrin, I used to run an Eco Tigers program when they were in grade 1 and senior kindergarten. So I got them very involved in my kids' school and helped empower them to take climate action. And turn them into mini David Suzuki's all over. So I'm really big on believing in empowering youth and educating youth and hearing their voices and letting them just run with the world. And so we had, at City Hall, we had lots of interns. You can do tons of internships, volunteering on campaigns. Often when you volunteer on a campaign, it's like a big eye-opener, but then that might translate into volunteering in the politician's office and maybe a job at some point. But you can go on tours, as I said, everywhere. I would go bring kids in for tours at City Hall, and doing that now at Queen's Park, the Pink Palace. And also you can, I would go out and speak to classes. I also would accost my kids' friends, trying to get them to vote and whatnot. And just, vote and maybe think about running. Because the mayor of Brockville at one point was 22 years old. He got elected at 22. You can do it too.
Yes, we can. What do our other panelists think are the best ways to reach young voters? Does social media help?
If I can jump in, I'll just say quickly, I don't know if it's social media, but one of the side effects of the pandemic has been that before everybody, if you wanted to have your say before a city committee or city council, you had to go and depute, they call it, in person. During the pandemic, they said, no, you can essentially do it by Zoom or phone, And it actually opened up a whole new world for people who either just don't want to go to City Hall, they find it intimidating, or it's far if they're in one part of the city, or for people with disabilities and others who it's hard to do. So I think, and the city is going to keep that. They're not going to make it go away. So that opens up a whole avenue for young people to make a deputation and to have their say. Mary-Margaret and I were talking just casually about a skateboard park that doesn't have lights. That's the kind of thing where you can be 12 years old and make a deputation to a city committee through your computer and make your case. And the politicians will listen and your voice should have sway. And I'll just add that during the Rob Ford years, Rob and Doug Ford decided at one point that one of the big problems in Toronto was we had too many libraries. And they said, we're going to close libraries. There was a mass of deputations. People came down. And I think the star of the show was a girl who I believe was 14 from Scarborough. They held them over the night, basically, to try and get as many people to drop off as possible. 2 or 3 in the morning, she gave a deputation. She cried her eyes out, talking about how much she loves her library. And Rob Ford, please do not close my library. Rob Ford didn't appear moved, but everybody else in the room was, and everybody who watched it on video said that was incredibly powerful. And I actually think it changed the balance in the way people were talking about whether we should look at these cuts or whether that had to be off the table.
Incredible. Would either of you like to chip in? What are the best ways to reach young voters?
Those are good questions, and I think that's something that the pandemic taught us was the power of social media and the power of online platforms. It's a challenge and a double-edged sword when you have a lot of misinformation that is available online, but it's also really empowering for a young person to go on Instagram and see who's running in their ward and be able to send them a direct message. And before social media, that was something almost unheard of, to have that type of access to the people who are going to be representing you. So by allowing the people who are running to have that type of connection to young people is very empowering.
I'm just going to chip in here quickly. I definitely agree with the whole idea that social media is the key to success because you can reach a wide audience in very little time. But the main issue here is that a lot of young people, they feel if they're going to go into politics, they think they have to go into partisan politics, and that's the problem, is that they don't want to label themselves with a party. And so here is where I would kind of push on a lot of NGOs, and there's a lot of them, Future Majority is one of them, of the non-partisan organizations to kind of reach out to children, not children, but like young voters, and let them come in and let them go to different parties, several different parties, and ask them all different questions and kind of engage with the Canadian political system, not just one Canadian political party. I think that's like the main thing, that a lot of young people don't know they have choices. And like other than just the main parties, there's a lot of smaller parties in Canada as well. Just engage and see where you find yourself aligning. Don't think you have to force yourself to align with any one belief because of your parents, because of your community, because of anything.
Thank you. We've talked about what the politicians can do. We've talked about the power that these democratic structures hold in terms of, opening up deputations on Zoom, etc. You've talked about NGOs. Let's talk a little bit about the role of journalists, as so many of us here are in the room. We, as journalists, are sometimes given many different titles and functions. In J School, I'm sure most of you, in communication theory, we talk about journalists as watchdogs of democratic institutions, or journalists as objective gatekeepers of the media. David, what can journalists do to spur democratic curiosity among youth? And a little double-barrel follow-up for you there. How do you engage with young folks when reporting on City Council?
It's a tricky question, and I think things are in flux. There's a big debate going on with journalism right now. I think people, older journalists, my generation, the idea was you had to always remain objective, and you were basically presenting the sides and not taking a stance. I think there's a younger wave of journalists that have said, no, I can be an activist journalist. I can declare right away that I believe this, and I'm gonna report the sides I see, but I'm not gonna pretend that I don't have a side when it comes to something like climate change. I'm not gonna say anymore that maybe climate change isn't real. So that's kind of, I think that's a healthy debate, and I think it's probably, if I'm honest, I'm gonna say it's more likely that younger journalists are gonna connect with younger people than somebody in my generation. Having said that, I would say that it is incumbent on media, including of all ages, to try and connect with young people, if nothing else, for self-interest, because we want the more people watching us. A lot of us work for profit-making companies or companies that hope to make a profit but don't. And the more people that are engaged both in politics and in reading about it through the media, it will help. So I know the Toronto Star has had TikToks. We've done things with Instagram. We've done things with different platforms. I'll say that in general, we have not succeeded yet, and we're still trying to crack that nut. And I would be happy to hear for any ideas of how we connect on what are sometimes pretty serious and kind of can maybe almost seem like take your medicine kind of issues, like you should know this, but somehow giving them a way that doesn't make them frivolous or doesn't reduce them, but makes them palatable for a generation that primarily gets their information digitally and in different channels than the old, say, traditional newspaper or radio or TV streams. I will admit, anytime I see young people at City Hall, which unfortunately is not that often, I always make an effort to connect with them if I can. Say, what are you doing here? Is your school class? I've often spoken to school classes who come through, sometimes college, sometimes younger. But, and then Twitter, which I don't think a lot of young people are on Twitter. I'm on there a lot, and you never know what ages. There are some, including there's one political columnist, I think he's 15. So there are a range of voices, but I think that's, as I said, that's kind of a nut to be cracked.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. I know David and I are the self-declared journalists on the panel, but would anyone else like to add in a comment why their opinion of how should journalists try and connect with young people?
So obviously I'm no journalist, but I commend all of you guys here especially, because I know today journalists are being pressured a lot and they're actually under attack quite a bit for reporting, which very much usually is the truth. And so for all of you to actually continue in this path to try and become journalists, to continue the whole idea of free speech and the whole idea of the truth, freedom of the truth and freedom of the press, and for everyone in Canada to know what's going on, it's very commendable and wonderful. When it comes to youth, youth are getting more engaged, and the whole reason that a lot of youth issues are actually being talked about by politicians is because of journalists picking it up and reporting on it and pressuring politicians to take a stand on them. For example, climate change. Climate change is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for 30, 40, 50 years. But it's only recently started to kind of go in the headlines, as of the early 2010s, because journalists have continued to pressure politicians to answer questions about it, to answer what we're going to do about it, to answer about how volatile the situation is. So journalists have a huge hand in youth issues in order to get them to the politicians and to get the politicians to actually care about them.
Thank you.
I wanted to just second that and say a huge round of applause and a lot of respect for all of the young journalists over here. I came into this room and I wasn't expecting to see that many students, and it just warms my heart to see so many students putting their lives into, dedicating their lives and taking the risks that it is to be a public servant and to spread truth and to spread information that is very, very necessary. So thank you to all of you for what you do.
I was just going to add that it's old school, but it would be great if newspapers had a column, a youth column, and I would empower you to write letters to the editor. I know it's different than your social media, but there are so many newspapers there. Think of your big ones like Toronto Star, Globe, and whatnot, but also your local little ones like Beach Metro News is one of the most well-read papers. Phenomenally well read in the East End. And so a letter to the editor about an issue that matters to you, and then it goes online as well, or an op-ed piece, and just pitch your stories, because we need to hear from you. We need to wake up and hear from you and listen to you and give you a platform.
Thank you all. Let's talk more about the current ways in which we try to get young people in schools interested in elections. We know, of course, of Student Vote Canada, which is a mock voting exercise in elementary and high schools whenever there is a federal election. There's also student government, so student councils and associations in high schools, colleges, and universities, where students elect fellow students who represent themselves in bodies of authority, academic senates, etc. A fact that I'm always acutely aware of as someone who came in second in my high school's election for head boy. Anyways, Tima, if you could get us started on this one. How engaged is the Centennial College community in student politics? And what did you notice during your own campaign?
Quite a lot to share, so many reflections. So the answer would be different if you ask pre-pandemic and post-pandemic or during pandemic. Before the pandemic, we saw about, if we take an average of 2 years, about 18% of the student population taking part in voting. It dropped down to 10% during those 2 years of the pandemic, even though during the pandemic, the campaigns were very, very competitive and the content was produced with so much quality. Even then, we did see a drop. So we're excited to be back in person and having that type of engagement with students again. What I noticed during my own campaign, one, I'm really grateful that I was running against other candidates who were so passionate and so competent. And seeing that type of competition gave a lot of encouragement to students to say, okay, we see we have an option to choose amongst very competent candidates. And that's very empowering, knowing that you are going to make that choice and see yourself represented. So it's exciting to see more candidates running, but something in terms of engagement is what level was that engagement. So for myself, if I look at my campaigns, they were running on YouTube, on Instagram, and internally in Microsoft Teams in the college, and that would account for about 600 students, but 900 students voting for me, and about 900. So where did that extra hundreds come from? I think it has to do with the word of mouth and students who didn't engage but trusted somebody else who engaged. So different levels of engagement.
Would anyone else like to comment? We're talking about effectiveness of student electoral exercises. What are things that can be improved to bolster participation?
I just want to add something quickly. I was in a student council, but it was high school, not university level. The main issue is like student government is such a good opportunity to kind of get young people, you know, the bitten by the democracy bug, you know, in a way that they start believing in the democratic system. The issue comes when a lot of student councils don't have enough autonomy or don't have enough power to do anything for the students. So basically they're just elected as figureheads, you know, showing that, you know, the student council exists, but they can't really get anything done. They can't really address any of the student issues. And the problem is when that happens at a young age, it imprints on a child and they start believing like, whoever I vote for isn't going to be able to get anything done. So the first idea is to give some student councils some more autonomy to be able to get things done and show a difference in whoever is the executive council. So that when kids, you know, at a young age or whatever age vote for a student council, they start understanding that their vote can actually make a difference. And they'll continue that practice, hopefully, into their older ages. Because the whole act of voting is mostly done because people are used to it. That's why we have a lot of older people coming to vote, because they're used to it for many years.
Questions open to both of you.
I'll just add that I'll admit when I was in high school and university, I was too shy, too scared to run for anything. But I think when things changed, since when I was young, when you were trying to get into post-secondary, into a university or college, or when you were applying for a job, people really just looked at your marks and that was it. Now it's a whole different ballgame where your active involvement in things, including student government, is really, could make the difference between you getting the position you want or you don't want. And that became acutely clear to me when I edited, one of my nieces was applying for a very difficult to get into university program, and the fact that she was student council president at her high school was a huge feather in her cap, and that was the thrust of her letter. And she ended up, now she's going to that school. So if there's a way to like let people know that even if it's hard, in hindsight back then, like if I knew what I was facing, now I probably would have stuck my neck out and tried.
And when I was in high school, I wanted to be a journalist. And I actually did co-op at the Enterprise Bulletin newspaper in Collingwood in grade 13. And I sure as heck never wanted to go into politics. My dad was mayor of Collingwood, and I vowed I would never, ever, ever go into politics. So careful what you, never say never. I'm just going to say, as candidates, electoral candidates, or political candidates, it behooves candidates to empower, inspire, embrace, and attract youth on their campaigns. And for my latest run as being for member of provincial parliament, we had tons of youth, and honestly, their energy was amazing. And I learned hashtags from them. They learned how to do icebreakers from me, and we learned so much from each other. But things we did to keep them engaged and excited. We hosted movie nights. We had snacks. We had this huge snack cupboard. We were stuffing sunflower seeds to give out to remember the people in Ukraine, and we were giving them out at the door. All kinds of things, but it's really on the candidates to bring in youth because it's your future, as I say a million times.
Thank you for all your responses. Let's take the discussion to a slightly different direction, a direction about enfranchising more young people. So at the time of the 2016 census, there were more than 1 million non-citizens living in Ontario, and more than 70% of these were in our city, in Toronto. Since these are residents who live, work, and contribute to our cities and our municipalities, should non-citizens, including young, permanent, and temporary residents like international students, be allowed to vote in municipal elections like they do in New York City? What do you think about this, Mary-Margaret?
Thank you very much. I did not know that fact, so now I'm going to research that and take that up as something to think about. I definitely think permanent residents should be able to vote. They have skin in the game, they pay taxes, they live here, they belong to communities, so definitely a believer of that. I'm also a big believer in lowering the voting age. So I think it's been talked about at 16. If there's a leadership race, which there actually is a leadership race coming up for the NDP and the Liberals, you can be 14 and vote in that leadership race. So you might just want to you can get your ticket to that party just to vote in that leadership race, and then end your membership if you want. But just have that experience. That is fine. That is, your democratic right. So definitely we need to figure out different ways to engage younger people, and there are a whole slew of them.
Thank you.
I'll be old school journalist and not give an exact opinion. I will just say that I've interviewed, because I'm interviewing a lot of candidates now, I'm going out to different wards and talking about the ward races and what they're seeing. And I'd say either 2 or 3 candidates have mentioned, especially if it's at a ward where they have a campus, either a university or college, where they'll go to a door, and it turns out there's 8 or 10 people living there because it's essentially a rooming house for students, primarily a lot of foreign students, who in some cases are living here for 3 or 4 years, but then they quickly realize none of them can vote. And they'll have people come to the door and say, here's their issues, they're engaged in Toronto, they've lived here for a couple of years, but the candidates say, I feel terrible, but I kind of have to say, there's no votes here, I have to go to the next house. And that obviously seems to point to me to be a real problem.
I just want to quickly add to that, because it was actually a conversation I was having with someone, I think a year ago, and we were talking about how she was a PR, and she would get she was a Canadian citizen, and she would get candidates come to her door, and she would tell them, oh, I'm a PR, and then the candidates that would just leave right after that, she wouldn't engage with them. The ones who would still stay just to get an insight of the problems that she was facing because she was still a resident, she would vote for them. So I thought that was extremely interesting in a way, because she wanted to see who actually cares about the community versus who only cared about votes. So that's just a very interesting thing that I thought was smart of her.
I want to add that the last I checked, Centennial had 52% international students, and the fact that so much of our college is represented by people who come here and who want to create a life here. I think that even in the life of international students, and maybe a lot of us in the room might be able to testify to that, it's different from a long time ago, where international students would come and their intention was to get an education and return back. A lot of international students are now coming with the intention to become future Canadians, and to keep them so far away from the opportunity to get to participate in the democratic process is really difficult, and it's really heartbreaking to see that. And with students in the college system and students in student politics, our executive director was saying that it's been a long time since we've had a domestic student be a president, because in our own student government, we're seeing a lot of international students who are engaged, who are advocating, who are working with college authorities. So when we can see the evidence of international students being so engaged in school government and in student government, then that's evidence to say that they're going to be engaged in community governance. So I strongly am behind having voting being extended to permanent residents.
Thank you all. Do we have time for one more question from me before we move on to the audience? Okay, thanks, Mary. Okay, so this is the last question from me. People vote when it's convenient. How can we make this process easier for people? For everyone, of course, but Jad, I would love if you could start us on with this one. Is it time to embrace digital votes to encourage involvement? We know that Cambridge in Ontario has online voting. Should Toronto be doing the same?
So when we're trying to engage young voters, I know, for example, in the federal Elections Canada used to have campus voting for university students. Unfortunately, because of COVID, they did not do it, in the 2021 elections. But obviously, we have to make it as convenient as possible. Now, when it comes to digital voting, I'd love to say yes, we do need digital voting because, it's time. We've come so far. You're telling me this is the first time hearing Cambridge does it. The only idea that I would worry about is if we have people start questioning the whole election process because of it. I remember just because in the municipal elections, we have the machine that reads the votes. And when I was supervising a polling station with Elections Ontario, I had several people come up and say, oh, these are like the machines that they had in America where they got the votes wrong or something like that. So you do have a lot of voter pessimism, and we don't want that distrust to grow when it comes to elections. Do I think digital elections work well? I do, and I really hope that we have them implemented. But when you do so in a way where we ensure that the trust in the democratic process is not altered or lost in any capacity.
I can add to that a little bit because I did a story for the Toronto Star about this is the first civic election where people citywide could vote by mail. It was done once before in a by-election. It was a little bit of a process. You had to register, you had to make sure you're on the voter list, you had to get a package sent to you, and then you had to mail it back within a certain time frame. But you could essentially vote across the city, people across the city could vote without leaving their homes for the first time. So then my question was, well, what about online voting? I know they do it for Conservative Party leaderships and other kinds of contests. So I talked to a university professor who's an expert in voter systems and the legitimacy of voter systems. And basically the explanation he gave me was that there are a few places in Ontario where there's online voting. They're primarily smaller municipalities. He said, here's the problem, and it's exactly what you referred to, that generally a third party, a private company is hired to run it, and they see the back end of where all the votes are. They report the results, but a lot of it's proprietary. They don't just open it up so anybody can see it. He said with a normal ballot system, a paper ballot where you go, or even where you mail it in, there's scrutineers for the candidates who watch the votes get counted, and they can affirm, yes, it was done fairly, or no, it's not. I think, but basically he said, until you actually had a government running an online system where you could have that same level of transparency, that's the big risk, is that we end up with a Dominion voting system, kind of like Trump nightmare here, where it is open to challenge the system and say it's not a legitimate vote.
Yeah, so this was the first time for me when I was running provincially. I knocked on a door, and an older woman had an envelope, and she said, I voted for you, you're in the envelope, you're in the envelope. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, and so that was the first time I had had someone vote for me by mail. And so I think that's great. And we should be looking at every new innovative idea to get people to vote. So it's interesting what I'm hearing about digitally right now, but I will tell you there are other ways. First of all, the hours of the polling stations are not conducive to people working. Lots of times parents are going to drop their kids off at the school where the polling station is, but the station's not open till they've already left for work. So that's a pain, and you guys going off to work or school, whatever, might be the same. The proxy system, the other one first is advanced polls are, they're never at Thanksgiving. So when you're home, so if you've gone away to school and you want to vote in Toronto, that's impossible unless you're going to do the proxy system, which is very complicated. If you do it municipally, I did it once for a friend who was apathetic, so I had to go down to City Hall, pick up the form, get her to sign it, explain the candidates to her, take it back down to get this stamp affidavit on it, and then vote. Who's going to do that? That's a pain in the butt. And then if you're doing that, there's no proxy system provincially, only municipally. And I will say that some people do like to go to actually the polling station to vote because it's a social outing, especially for seniors, see your neighbors and whatnot.
I would just like to add a little comment because Mary-Margaret brought this up. Many Ontario students who have moved to Toronto for their studies actually have the opportunity to cast 2 ballots in the upcoming municipal election. One in their home municipality and one here. That means that they have a powerful say in the democratic process in a few weeks, probably even more so than most. So if you're a student who is an Ontario student who has moved to Toronto for school, you can vote twice, one in your home municipality and one in the city of Toronto. Would you, David or Tima, like to add?
Mm-hmm. So the concept of online voting, it's so interesting to hear the perspectives on the trust in the system as well. I want to say that one of the concerns that students brought up with the last election was the lack of the on-campus voting, and on-campus voting made it accessible to some degree to a lot of students to be able to vote. But now, since a lot of classes are done online or are done in hybrid fashion, a lot of students are not always on campus. We don't see the same type of student populations on campus, the 5 days a week of students on campus. So even with bringing back on-campus voting, electronic voting could really supplement the process. A lot of students really hope that that is an opportunity that they could have to get to do things electronically. You can renew your driver's license electronically, but you can't vote electronically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you all for your thoughtful statements. You've given us a lot of food for thought. It's time to move to questions from our online audience, which journalism student Marva Trim has been collecting, and I have them right here. Okay, so the first question from our audience is, which current high-profile issues for Toronto do you believe will be important for young people in the upcoming municipal election? Whoever wants to take that. Please go ahead.
I'm going to say transit, and here I want to plug in a great organization, TTC Riders, that CCSAI has worked with. One of the things that this organization has done is created a candidate report card, has sent out a survey to the different candidates to ask for their opinion on certain transit issues. Considering that in Toronto we have a lot of transit changes that are coming, transit lines that are being shut down and built, and that really impacts young people. A lot of young people are not driving, they are relying for getting to work, getting to school, getting home, and seeing friends. They're relying on transit, so I think that that's a big hot topic that is going to help make a lot of decisions.
I just want to plug housing, I guess. So, for example, housing is a huge issue in Toronto, especially for young people. I don't think a lot of young people even imagine themselves moving out of their parents' house or moving out of rental houses into buying their own homes. Mortgages are way out of reach, and house prices are way too expensive. Not to mention that the salary for a graduating student is nowhere near enough to qualify for anything today. I think maybe you can qualify for $200,000, which maybe gets you half a parking spot that you can share. So in Toronto, that is a huge issue, and especially when we look at new constructions going up, we need to make sure that a lot of those housing or a lot of those buildings that are going up have affordable housing set aside by city stipulation for young people or for even adults or families that cannot afford to buy a house in the regular market. We need to make sure that all the new construction puts aside affordable housing. Additionally, when we're looking at the new construction, we also want to make sure that they're all built because buildings are some of the largest emitters for greenhouse gases. So the whole idea is that we have to also make sure that the buildings and building codes are up to date to make sure that they're eco-friendly, make sure that they're sustainable and not adding to our pollution and our housing crisis. So, thank you.
I'm going to make a pitch for climate change because a lot of people think of it as being a federal issue because the Prime Minister will go off to Paris or somewhere and negotiate a new accord, or the provincial government maybe has an environment commissioner. A lot of stuff happens at City Hall that is going to directly affect whether or not Toronto and Canada help curb this huge global crisis. The City of Toronto has a plan called Transform TO, which is basically a roadmap of all the things we have to do to try and become a climate neutral city. There was a target to get to climate neutrality for all of Toronto, not just city buildings, but all the residents by 2050. In the last year of City Council, they moved out to 2040. And that is everything from building codes that you mentioned about trying to make, ensure the city can enforce how low polluting buildings are. It can make things like having, there is a rule that all new buildings are going to have somewhere to plug in your electric car. There is things like having on-street charging for people like me who don't have a driveway. And it's hard to, you think, well, I can't have an electric car, but you can be on-street chargers. There's a whole host of things that happen at the city level. And I remember when there was a big rally that marched around City Hall that was inspired by Greta Thunberg. Lots of people, including my daughter, marched in it. And I remember thinking a lot of those people don't realize how much impact they can have inside City Hall because a big part of the fight is happening there.
And yeah, my brothers call me the eco-witch of the East, so and that's why I got back into politics as the climate emergency. So ditto what Dave said, and Transform TO, I worked really hard at City Hall to get that passed through council. So climate emergency, for sure, housing, affordability, safe cycling infrastructure, TTC, and other basic things that you might think are too little, but people, it involves you. And I know my kids who are 23 and 24 spent a lot of time in parks in COVID, and you guys is like bathrooms, access to bathrooms, public washrooms in parks, and having fountains on. So anything that you want, ask for.
Thank you. For this next one, I'm going to try and combine two questions. One of the most frequent responses among young people is, it's one vote, it won't matter. What are your thoughts, and how can we address this voter apathy, and what role can education play in this?
Difficult question.
One vote matters. Your voice matters. I told you, someone almost lost, or they just won on 9 votes. It can come down to the wire. I kid you not. It's a nail biter. Volunteer on an election campaign, and it's like the highest adrenaline rush you will ever have in your life. So it does matter. Your voice matters. The candidates and everyone need to hear from you. Lots of people who volunteer on campaigns are older. If they see you out there, they hear your voice and what matters to you. Don't give up, don't lose faith, don't have apathy. You can make a difference, and if you're gutsy enough, run for office and I'll help you.
I just want to echo that 100%. It feels like every time I speak with any of my friends, they all hit me with the same thing. Oh, my vote's not going to really matter, just one vote. And then I talk to maybe all my friends, and they all say the same thing, and those are 9 of them right there that could have maybe lost the election for someone or won the election for someone. When we're talking about youth voters, and when we say that we make up 40% of the Ontario population, we can literally pick the government ourselves with the amount of voter apathy that exists from everyone else. Youth voters alone could choose who governs Ontario for the next 4 or so years, or who governs the city of Toronto for the next 4 or so years. And every vote counts, literally every vote counts, and if we all have that mentality, then we're all not going to vote, and then we all don't have a say. That's the problem.
I'm going to say I really empathize with that, but also as a young person, hearing that every vote counts also puts a lot of pressure on young people to say, okay, if every vote counts, then whatever I vote for is really important. And sometimes it feels safer to abstain from voting than to vote for something that might not be the right choice or the best choice. And I think that one of the ways to move past that is to be vulnerable, but be vulnerable together. And I think if a lot of young people together are able to say, I'm afraid of voting, I don't know who to vote for, can we all sit down together and see, what do you think? What does this person think? What does my class think? What does my neighbors think? I think that can create a culture to create that confidence in voting and that confidence in the democratic system.
I'll just add two quick things. One is that there is definitely some apathy out there, and I think it's pandemic exhaustion, and I'm really hoping that we all just collectively move past it as we all kind of get our wind back after an extremely difficult 2 years. But there's no guarantees. I mean, you have to fight for democracy. I will say that I'd say it's worse in the United States, but even in Canada, there are parties and groups of primarily older people who control the political process who actively want to discourage people your age from voting. There are things they do, and I've heard political strategists talk about it. You know, it's not in our interest to have people who are under 25 come out and vote because they are primarily pandering. Say in Toronto, they're primarily pandering to people who own single-family homes. Toronto City Council doesn't look like the city it represents. They're older, whiter, more male, more likely to own a home, more likely to own a car, more likely to have mutual funds. And so you have to overcome that, you have to be smart, you have to organize, you have to fight. And I just will say, and one vote, you think of an election, but even one voice or one call to a city councilor's office or one email can make a difference. I've had city councilors who changed positions on issues like, should we regulate rooming houses, which can affect students and other things. And I'll say, why'd you switch? And they said, well, I was bombarded with like calls and emails. And say, well, how many did you get? 30 or 40. In a city of 3 million, that's not that many people because a lot of people don't engage. So if you do engage, you actually can have an impact. If you and 10 friends get them, suddenly they feel bombarded and they might switch their position.
Thank you. Those were excellent questions from our audience, and it's really great to see so many people interested and clearly engaged with our panelists. You've given us a lot to think about. It's time to move to the first question from the journalists in the room tonight. I've heard from your professors that you've been hard at work preparing and have lots of questions. So who's going to go first? Please come up here to the podium. And if you can please identify yourself as you approach the mic.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Morrell. I'm writing for The Observer. So my question is kind of going to be a two-parter over here. I spoke about this briefly with Tima, but do you guys or anybody over here have any familiarity with doomerism or what it is to be a doomer? And if not, I can already see by your faces you don't. It's just a more popular belief with millennials and Gen Zs right now that there actually is no future and that in 30 years we're going to be either doomed from war or from climate change. Now, while I understand that that is kind of a unrealistic way of looking at things, this is quite a popular viewpoint. So what can we do to be able to quell hold on, I have it written down over here. How do we shift this mindset from doomerism into hopium?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, but I didn't know that term, so thank you for teaching it to me. But I have kids, I think your age-ish, and my daughter's talked about not procreating because of the world that, you know, she doesn't want to raise a child in, and I think that's sad, and that's why I'm back in office to try and change that. But also, you can make the difference. You can. Dave gave the example of the girl who fought hard to keep the libraries open. And it reminded me, I had a couple kids who wanted a stop sign on their street. And they got it. They wrote to me. And we went through the process and we did it. You can make a difference. I know that the world is going to hell in a handbasket a little bit, but you can make the difference. Don't give up. Get off that couch, wherever you are, Netflix or whatever your Instagram, and think of something you're passionate about. Think of something that bugs the heck out of you, and write to a politician about it, and get an idea. Don't just say, I don't like that, but get your idea. And people should and will listen.
I'm going to say doomerism new to me, but I guessed what it was because I have a friend, a journalist named Karen Ho, and she coined the frame doom scrolling on Twitter. Yeah. All right, she periodically tweets, are you doom scrolling? And now that's being picked up in the New York Times and everybody's written about the idea of just people on Twitter kind of looking for like the chaos in the world that says everything is going to end and there's no hope in doing anything, which is obviously not productive. So I'll say I've had kind of a similar discussion with my kids who are teenagers and about how everything terrible is. And I always say to them, like, 99% of happiness to me is perspective. And if you can look outside your own situation, and I'm old enough that I grew up when the Soviet Union was the big enemy and nuclear threat hung over all our heads, and it seemed like that was never going to end. And suddenly the Soviet Union stopped, being an entity. I'm old enough to remember when Northern Ireland was this intractable problem, and the troubles were going to continue forever, and sectarian violence was continue claiming lives, and suddenly there was the Good Sunday Agreement. There have been, in my lifetime, getting into my late 50s, there have been probably 5 or 6 of those things that seemed like they could not be solved. Apartheid in South Africa, which, lots of people, including Canadians, banded together and helped end. And I just have to believe, as terrible as this climate crisis is, and many of the other things in the world, if everybody gets involved and works on the solution and doesn't give up and doesn't give in to doomerism, we can do it.
So this is also the first time I'm hearing about this, but as a political science student, I feel a lot, empathetic towards that, because I just finished a class called How Democracies Die and how there's no future and we're all just going to go into autocracies. So, and opening the news every day, it does feel like the world is just getting worse and worse, and you're just waiting for that glimpse of hope. But, I think just like David said, we've had instances in history where all hope seemed lost. But then, of course, somehow we found our way out, and that's because people got involved. People went out, sorry, it sounds like a broken record, but people went out to vote. People went out to make a change. People went out to start advocating. So I guess my message to, do they call them doomers?
Yeah, doomers.
Doomers would be, take what's your biggest fear and make it into your passion. Make it something that you want to work towards ending. Go start advocating on behalf, if you're scared of climate change, become a climate change activist. Go around, try to get people to vote for politicians who are more, who are trying to work towards better climate initiatives. Try to make it a passion project and try to solve it yourself. I guess that's the only thing I can say.
Be inspired by the do in doomer.
Exactly. Thank you.
And I'm so sorry. Just to answer, a follow-up on that, just because. So a lot of what I hear you guys saying is you're putting a lot of the onus on the students and the people that are the youth to be able to reach out. But to tie this back into doomerism, how can the youth put trust into politicians when they are stuck in the mindset that they have been given a bad hand, a horrible world to look after? And how are we supposed to now, how can they put trust into the government now and to actually put trust into democracy once more,
If I can just add, go out and run for elections. Take it into your own hands, because we always talk about, children being the future or the young people being the future. Well, the future is here. It's time for us to kind of take the baton, even if they're not willing to give it up yet. Go out for elections, and then other youth start electing younger people into office. And let's start, if we can't see the change happening, let us become the change, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add two thoughts to that? One is, if we're going to be doomed, how about we become doomed a little bit less? So if we're thinking about climate change, if it's going to end up being a 4-degree world, can we make it a 3-degree world? Can we change a little bit that will have a big impact? And then another point on running, I hated student politics or any politics. And I did not want to run in student government. I wanted to stay as far away as possible, but I still cared about advocacy. And I was still there speaking for students and talking to my colleagues and seeing how I can get involved in the college. And it was from the push of so many teachers and peers who said, Tima, you really need to do this. The deadline's coming up. Run for vice president. And in the very last day, I made the decision to run for vice president. And I'm going to be super vulnerable here and say I cried through the campaigning process. It's not an easy process to put yourself out there, especially if you're not someone who is looking for that type of attention or is used to that type of attention. And then the second year, on the very last day to declare my intention to run for candidacy, just a couple of hours before that, it was a lot of push again from my peers and from mentors to say, Tima, do this again, run for another year. And I empathize. It's hard to do that, but it's also really important to do that. It's really important to have your voice there. And now I'm able to see the impact and the power that this type of position comes with, and I did not see that before. So please do run. I'll vote for you.
I'm just going to make a pitch that if you don't feel you can be a candidate and activism isn't really your thing, then journalism is an important part of the democratic process. And if young people, for many good reasons, feel like they can't trust government or the government institutions, our role as journalists and your role as student journalists, soon to be hopefully working in the profession, is to sort of what I always call lift the hood. You know, you can look at a car, but like what's going underneath it? There's a large industry that is involved in communications or public relations that is kind of gift wrapping boxes and then handing to the public. And our job as a journalist is to kind of be like the kid on Christmas morning and rip it open and say, no, it's actually just a rock or whatever is inside the box. And I think while some people may say, well, that's sort of showing the flaws in the system, I'd say you can't fix the flaws unless you know what they are. So to me, that's a good way of trying to restore trust by showing the problems.
And I would say there are good politicians out there. So find one you believe in and follow them. I ran on term limits, mainly to, well, I didn't want to go into politics, but also to level the playing field. Dave's already spoken about the makeup of City Hall does not reflect Toronto at all. So I ran on 2 terms. And so I promised it, and I honored it, and I did it. And I just heard from your Malcolm, is he your professor? He said when he was something high up at National Post, they all had wagered a bet whether I would keep my promise. And he won. He was the only one who believed I would. So find a good politician.
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Yes. I am Muhammad Adris Malik, student of journalism. My question bit technical, and I hope so, as a legislative dog, Mary, and as a watchdog, David will answer in a better way, but all of other panelists can answer, definitely. The question is about the role of Election Commission of Canada. So, do you think, are you satisfied with the role of Election Commission of Canada to educate the youth to be participate in the democracy? And if not, then what are your suggestions to do it properly? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say I'll apologize in advance that I have covered some federal politics, but I haven't done any reporting on the Election Commission of Canada. The only thing I can relate is I know there's some people that say, should we have an Election Commission of Toronto? One of the big questions right now is, why don't we have more mayoral debates? Because there doesn't seem to be much of a mayoral race. Other people have said, well, federally or provincially, there's election commissions that essentially organize them and decide on the rules. Here, it's just kind of up to the Board of Trade or a community group to host it. So I'm afraid I just don't know enough about the Election Commission to really answer that question. Sorry.
And ditto on that. I'm more municipal and provincial, but I will say anything that adds more exposure to the candidates. So all candidates debates run by anyone and everyone, and I think I would have never skipped an all candidates debate. I don't agree with that. I think if you're putting yourself out there and running for office, it behooves you to be in front of people. It's actually a frightening event. And at one all candidates debate I was at, the incumbent wrestled me for the microphone, so that was a whole other story. And that's you can Google that. But yeah, anything to be transparent and democratic and open and accessible will be a good thing.
Yes, the other 2 panelists, please.
I don't know a lot about the Elections Commission, but I do just want to, you were talking about the idea of educating the youth.
Educating the youth from the Election Commission.
Yeah, about the elections. We need a lot stronger elections curriculum for young people, and we need one that's sure to not push them into any direction. And that's extremely hard, and that's where a lot of people go up in arms, because they're scared about maybe the teacher's own political opinions become imprinted on the child, because obviously when you're teaching a child, they can be very impressionable and they can take whatever you say without a grain of salt. They're just going to take it. So we need to ensure that whether it's, I don't know whose jurisdiction would be, the Elections Commission of Canada, whether it be a bipartisan committee of parliament, whoever it is, we ensure that there is a curriculum that teaches children about how Canada's democracy works, who's responsible for what jurisdictions are where, how our healthcare system works, how our judicial system works, and how elections actually work. because without that, then kids can never truly and fully engage in our democratic system.
And Ms. President, you also, please.
I'm going to say that the process and the operations of democracy is also a topic of democracy. So, for example, first past the post voting, is that a process that most of us agree with? Is that a process that we all stand behind? So even with the processes of democracy, it requires having that representation of someone who believes in the system that we believe in. So if it is the commissions, or it is the process or the philosophy of democracy, that's also a matter of representation, and that's also something that we can consider when we're voting for whoever we're voting for.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, good night, good evening. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Rodrigo. I'm a third-year student from the University of Toronto, both taking my third year here in Centennial. And I am not very familiar with this question is mostly for Ms. Tima Shah, but everyone can feel free to respond. Tima, I'm not very familiar with the CCSAI, but I am with my own student association, which last year has fallen under has made very controversial comments, which position them as too politicized in front of a larger group of students, and this has been reported by student publications. So I was wondering, you as the president of the CCSAI, how can student groups and youth organizations correctly or more democratically inform their student body without becoming too politicized in the way? Because this may discourage conflicting views and cause less participation in the long term. Thank you.
Can I get you to repeat the question part one more time?
Oh, sure. How can student and youth organizations more democratically inform their student body without becoming too politicized? Added to the fact that there are more than 30 candidates for the Toronto municipal election.
So correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're asking is how can we make sure that our student governments are not as polarized as our community governments?
Yes, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so first I'm going to say thanks for speaking up. Hello, good to meet you. CCSAI is a nonprofit organization that represents the about 22,000 students of Centennial College across all 5 campuses. On the board of directors, you have one president, hi, and you have one vice president from every single campus. So your campus also has a vice president who I will introduce you to. And it's very empowering for students to see themselves represented in an organization that is there to empower them, to provide them service, but also to be their voice in a college system and in a government system outside the college as well, advocating on a federal, provincial, and local level. In terms of how do we make sure that our organizations are not becoming polarized, one of the things that we're looking at is our policies and how can we increase democracy. So we're noticing a lot of times we have just one person running for a position. And when there's only one candidate, our policy used to be that person immediately became acclaimed, and that's it. Students didn't get to vote. Students didn't get to decide. One of the changes that after being elected we made, or after I was elected in this position, one of the things, points of my campaign was revisiting what democracy at CCSAI looks like. So now for next year in CCSAI elections, even if there is only one candidate running for a position, students will have the right to vote, yes, I support this candidate, or no, please open nominations again. So we're looking towards how we can create a more democratic process in having student representation. And in terms of having people who have different views, I think it's really healthy to have that. Centennial has so many different students who are coming from so many different places and have a lot of different values that they're bringing. I would not like to define the values of the organization and say only those students come up and be part of the organization. It really helps having a board that is diverse and has different opinions and is able to have that healthy debate. So maybe not toxic polarizing, but definitely diverse opinions.
Thanks, Tima. We can do 2 more questions from observer reporters. May I please request you to keep your questions short and succinct, please.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Austin Kelly. I'm currently an undergrad here. So the one question I have is that in the past 2 U.S. presidential elections, 5 out of 10 candidates were 5 of the oldest candidates to ever run for president. Currently in Canada, Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre are both 43 years old. Justin Trudeau is 50 years old. So obviously, it is kind of different between them being younger and them being older. Candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar are much younger. They've grown very popular on sites like Twitter. So I'm curious that for some older candidates, if you feel that some of the impact of voter apathy may be because young people just don't see themselves reflected in the politicians that are being elected.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's why we need things like term limits and other things, democratic reform, an overhaul. When I ran provincially just recently, so the Liberals had, they wanted to have, their pledge was, or their attempt was to have 30 under 30. So 30 candidates under 30 running for provincial politics. Well, we didn't have that. I was joking at the end. I think it was 60 under 60. But we did have some great young candidates. We had a girl in Belleville who was 24, and we had another young woman in Hamilton who was 20. And so I think, again, the onus is on the political party at the provincial and federal level to engage youth and to actually value them and care about their voices, to bring them in. And then municipally, it's up to you. So just do it.
I'll just add that it is, as I mentioned, Toronto City Council doesn't represent the city it serves in a bunch of different ways, and age would be one obvious part of it. The council's a lot older. And it's actually, the problem, that problem is kind of most acute at the municipal level because incumbency is such a big advantage for people. I interviewed some university professors about it, and basically they said that, you know, you have to have something good about you to get elected in the first place. But once you're in office, especially at the municipal level compared to provincial or federal, you have a 90% chance of getting reelected. And more of that is based on just you kind of getting a free ride as opposed to your personal attributes. And the result is you have city councilors who literally, it becomes a 30 or 30 plus year job. And it's really, really hard for younger politicians to break through. In this election in Toronto, we have 7 open races with no incumbent, which seems like a good opportunity. We have two former councillors who are trying to make a comeback, so that's maybe not exactly fresh blood. There's quite a number of candidates, I'd say, and primarily female in their 20s and 30s who are trying to break through and would definitely make council more representative. But in the current system, the odds are stacked highly against them. When I referenced before about there being, in some cases, systemic kind of barriers that are there on purpose, one of the ways that people thought you could draw more people in and get a bigger selection of people on council is to change the voting system. We mentioned first past the post that a lot of people don't think has run its course and doesn't do well. There was a ranked ballot option. The provincial government of the day made it illegal for any municipalities to use it, so they've actively pulled that off the table.
Yeah, just to echo that, I don't know about America, but I do know in Canada it's extremely hard to get rid of an incumbent if you're running against an incumbent. And I don't know if that's because Canadians generally don't like change, or because maybe if there's an incumbent, people don't think that they have to come out to vote. You know, that job's already taken care of. I don't know what the mentality behind it is, but I do know it's extremely hard to get rid of an incumbent. And you know, like David said, that goes on to be a 30-40-year job. I know in Mississauga we had Hazel McCallie and Hurricane Hazel. She was mayor for 34, 38 years, something like that. And so it's extremely difficult to get rid of an incumbent. And that's where it comes, whenever you're looking at, for example, federally, political politics, the parties that generally in the polls don't do well and aren't predicted to win at all, mostly Greens or the NDP, are usually mostly voted for by young people. And that's because young people at the time don't really care about polls. They're still hopeful. And so if we can bring that youthful, hopeful energy towards municipal politics, towards any election, and you have a larger segment of the youth coming out to vote, then you're going to see them kind of coming in a wave, because a lot of older voters are going to go back to the incumbent or go back to older people because they don't think young people are intellectually there or advanced or have the expertise or experience, which is odd because at the same time is you're trying to get rid of that kind of old system that's not working, but you still want the same experience as those people that haven't been working for so many years.
This is such a tough conversation because I feel you. I feel how difficult it is to see a system and to feel like that system is designed against you, and it's difficult to be hopeful in that kind of situation. But I also want to point out that if you were to look at the candidates for this municipal election, you will see some very new faces and you will see some young faces. And some of those new and young faces are actually doing really well. And you drive around or you take a transit around Scarborough area, Toronto area, and you will see signs from newer candidates. So even though the system is really difficult to break through, it's not impossible to break through. And as we get closer and closer to election, we see a lot of near successes. And I'm going to say that I believe that you should vote even if the party you're going to be voting for is not going to win, because it still makes a statement. It still makes a statement that I don't agree with the majority that is in power right now, and I want to make sure that that diversity in opinion and that diversity in candidates continues. So go out and vote and be hopeful.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Tima. We'll have one last question. I'm so sorry for the others, but you will have a chance to ask the panelists after the broadcast ends out in the corridor on their way out. But so sorry, we'll have one last question from the reporter.
Hi, my name is Liliana Erickson. I am a first-year journalism student here, and my question was, in the early months of the pandemic, there's a general trend towards political apathy and a marked decrease in participation in elections. However, in the early months of the pandemic, when everyone was off of work, there was an explosion in political discussion and also direct participation in the forms of protests, but also directly reaching out to elected officials through email and calling. So my question was, do you think this period offers any insight into what some of the solutions for this problem are, and maybe some of the factors that are repressing political participation amongst my generation?
Is that clear? Did we get the question?
Could you repeat?
Could you just repeat the question part of it? Okay.
Maybe I'll pardon the mask marks. So my question was, so there is a general trend towards political apathy and decreased political participation. However, in the early months of the pandemic, when everyone was off of work, there was an explosion in political participation and discussion, and in the form of, not at the ballot box, but people were reaching out to politicians, people in my generation who typically don't do things like that, protests, things like that. So my question is, does that period offer any insight into some of the factors that are inhibiting political participation amongst young people, and if there are some solutions there?
I'll just say that it reminds me a bit of when I talked about the young woman during the Rob Ford era, in that until there was a crisis where all of a sudden city services were threatened, people were fairly complacent, and then people kind of rose up once there was a crisis. And I think during the pandemic, we saw this crisis, and suddenly people had to be, also a lot of people couldn't work, so they maybe had more time, but all of a sudden everybody was saying, how should we handle this? Like, should there be a mask rule? Should there be this? Should you be able to go on a playground when we had that rule and it was rescinded? As far as carrying that forward, or what the rules are, I guess it would be maybe just take a look at the way people were communicating and expressing, and how are they reaching out to either their politicians or each other, or if there were neighborhood groups or Facebook groups. And I guess just trying to figure out how you can, instead of being a kind of emergency or pandemic or city service threatened kind of a model, to expand that into everyday lines of communication where just people are generally more engaged.
I would be curious to look into how CERB and other social services at that time played into it. And for a lot a lot of young people who were managing multiple jobs and just suddenly got laid off, and being able to have that social support also provided a little bit of security. And sometimes that security is really important in allowing a person to be democratically engaged. So maybe it's something to look at, like income disparity and the different challenges that people experience outside their lives, and those things become priority. And when getting food on your table or paying rent is your priority, getting involved democratically is not really something you think about, or not something you can afford to think about.
I would say, don't be shy about writing your politician. Don't be shy about calling them, or saying something on Twitter. You catch more flies with honey, though, on social media. But that is your democratic right. They're there to represent you. And all voices matter, whether you voted or didn't vote, whether you're 5 years old or you're 55, you matter. So don't be shy about doing that. If you have an idea about something, I had a young man come to me and he wanted a crosswalk across Woodbine Avenue. And apparently it had been asked for many times before and didn't happen. And he just had the problem and he had the solution. He's like, this is the problem. It's hazardous for all, it's dangerous for pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. And here's the solution. Let's get a crosswalk in. And I'm like, yeah, let's look at it. And within 24 hours, he made a petition. He had a QR code. He talked to his neighbors, did all this, the legwork, which is shocking because I would have helped with that. And then we got it in. So it can happen. Just be positive somehow.
This is a very important idea. I actually wrote about it in the University of Toronto Varsity. I'm somewhat of a journalist myself, but I wrote about the idea that in the early months of the pandemic, you had the BLM protests, you had the climate action protests, you had all these different things, and you had Canadian leaders going to these protests and showing solidarity with them. Even when you had the London attack, when the guy ran over the Afzal family, you had all leaders of the political federal parties and the Ontario provincial parties going there to show their support and giving speeches. Unfortunately, that wasn't an election season. When election season did come, you didn't hear about those issues. You didn't hear about, Black Canadians' problems. You didn't hear about, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism rising, anti-Asian hate because of COVID rising all across Canada. These issues didn't come about because all the protests and the legwork that happened fizzled out. And so this is where, we come back to the voters, where we have to keep that pressure up. And of course, back to the journalists who continue presenting these pressures to the politicians to ensure that they act upon it and always remember that they're being held accountable by the public.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your questions. As we move towards the pointy end of our discussion today, we're going to do a bit of a concluding rapid-fire round. I'm going to ask each of you panelists to summarize in 15 seconds what is one reason why young voters watching this panel today should take the leap and vote in this coming election. And we'll go from left to right, starting with Mary-Margaret, please. One reason why young voters watching this should vote in the coming municipal election.
Well, as Amelia Earhart says, be more than a passenger in life. Your voice matters.
I'll just say that I think I feel pretty confident, and I think most of you would agree with you that my generation has screwed things up pretty badly. And that there are a lot of forces who want to stop you from solving it and making things better, but I believe you can do it, and it's going to make smashing through some barriers to do it, but it's possible.
Think of one municipal issue that really annoys you, whether it's garbage pickup or the snow plow in front of your house, whatever it is. Think about that and think you can make a change and go out and cast your ballot.
I'm going to say that just like yourself, there's a lot of other young people, and some of those young people have taken the very scary step of running. And if they have taken the very, very scary step, the most that we can do for them, or the best that we can do for them, is to support them in that very scary step and make it a little bit less scary. So find out the people who are voting and show some support to them.
Thank you. And with that, we're done. That was an intense and informative 90 or so minutes. And I want to thank all of the panelists today for sharing their thoughts tonight. You've given us a lot to consider. You can have that applause. Yeah. I'm going to turn the mic over to Tim Doyle, the coordinator of Centennial's journalism program, to wind things down. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Akrit. And thanks, everyone. What a great night, and what an important conversation. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your insight and keeping Akrit for keeping us on track and engaged. Well done. I'd like to thank all the students and staff who contributed today as well. I mean, the broadcast students. What is it, 5 weeks you've been here and you're running this show like pros? Well done to the broadcast students. To the journalism students here, it's great to see here and in the newsroom. There's a group in our newsroom as well. It's great to see your engagement here, your insightful questions, and the attention you're paying to this important issue. I'd like to thank our students here helping out, Marva and Maddie. Thank you both very much. And the staff who helped make tonight a success, Nicole D'Souza, Ishrat Gulshan, Tony Stockton, Phil Elvis, Chayton Premji, who bailed us out in the newsroom and gave us some sound, Scott Hosmer, Rowan McLeish, and my journalism colleagues who are here with their students, Phil Lee Shannock, Lisa Young, and our chief organizer, Mary Vallis. Thanks, everyone. Now, before you go, October 24th, what are you going to do that day? Vote. You're going to vote, right. Don't forget to vote if you're eligible to vote. And if you're an Ontario student, you may have a chance to vote twice. So take advantage of your opportunity, make a difference, let your voice be heard. If you haven't received a voting card, go to your polling station. Get your voting card, get your name on the list. There's even going to be a polling station here in this campus for Toronto Danforth. So thanks again for joining us tonight at the Story Arts Centre in our great new library. And thanks to those of you who watched online and took part. For those of you here in person, hope you make time to speak to our students as you leave the campus. They still have questions, they want to share their thoughts, and they want to hear your opinions. So thank you all very much.